Hello, my name is Andrew White, and I'm the Programme Director for the Advanced Management and Leadership Programme here at Side Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm delighted to be here today with Rachel Botsman, a Trust Fellow in the Business School, who's going to be talking about her contribution to the programme. So Rachel, over to you. If you could start by just talking a bit about your teaching and research and why you focus on trust as a really important issue for leaders today.
Great. So as you mentioned, Andrew, I am the Trust Fellow at the school. I think it's the first time we've created that role, which is a sign of how important trust is being recognised in business and society, because it's always been important. My interest started in this topic over a decade ago. So I started looking at trust in digital platforms and wrote a book on the sharing economy, and then have sort of widened my lens to take a more macro view as to what is happening in the world with my last book, Who Can You Trust?
Fantastic. And one of the things I've always admired about you is your ability to see what really matters on the leadership agenda. So can you talk a little bit about what you think the leaders on the programme need to know about trust and what they'll get from you when you deliver your session?
Well, trust, it's such a funny thing because it's not a subject that leaders don't know anything about. They often come into a class or a program knowing that trust is important. But when you really dig in and you ask people to explain what trust is and the role that it plays in their organization, whether that's internally with their teams, the way they earn trust as a leader, or externally in terms of how customers, regulators, or other stakeholders trust them, you realize that it's sort of stopped at the conversational level. So this is an opportunity to think really in two different ways. One, what does trust mean to me? How do I behave in ways that are trustworthy, and what are areas that I need to improve on? And secondly, where does trust really fit into our strategy? Where do we have trust issues, whether that's be in sales or product development or in regulations, whatever that may be, and what can we actually do about it? So it's sort of this combination of self-reflection and personal development, and then more a macro lens, I guess, in terms of really thinking about trust and how it works in your organization.
I guess what you're doing is you're giving people a real, almost taking something which is quite ethereal and then helping them think through very practically what they can do. And I guess conversely, what mistakes they can avoid. So are there certain companies that you see as real good case studies and perhaps, where companies have made mistakes where other leaders can learn?
It's a great question. What I see in organizations where trust is very much a part of the culture is actually the way I teach, which is they think about trust, they talk about trust, and they act on trust. And that may sound obvious, but a lot of organizations, they stop at the talking point. So a great example of this is Salesforce. So Mark Benioff will go so far as saying, trust is our highest value. And anytime that trust isn't our highest value, something bad happens. And it's part of the way he talks, it's part of the way he talks internally into the media, how he makes decisions, and it's very much a foundation of his culture. So you have organizations like that. And then you have organizations like Airbnb, which I've spent a lot of time with, where their whole business is dependent on trust. But they talk about and act on trust very differently. So they think about trust very much in terms of design. So what does the role trust play in getting people to use a new product or service, in getting people to take what I call a trust leap? And then the third type of organization is actually an organization that has made many mistakes with trust in the past. So I work a lot with banks, and they've gone sort of through trust therapy, right? And they've come out reformed the other end and realized that they were making decisions purely through a financial lens, not through a trust lens. And they can become best in class because they know the consequences of making a mistake that can damage trust but still make money for them.
Yeah, so in some ways, trust is not separate from financial performance or long-term financial performance. You can put it there, but in some ways, it either supports you in the way you talk about Salesforce, or it comes and really bites you and undermines that long-term performance.
It's exactly right, and it's almost I advise people to not think of it as sort of a trade-off, we're making a trust decision here, because it sounds slightly cliche to say, but if you invest in trust, it does return value over the long term. So really, we see these two currencies, if you like, going hand in hand.
Yeah, and so from the program's point of view, it really supports our vision of creating leaders fit for the 21st century, leaders who see the world in the right way, and not just see the world in the right way, can also act in the right way as well.
Yeah, and that really, I think, fits into sort of the first lens on this, which is rethinking what trust and being trustworthy means to you as a leader. And one of the things I'm looking at in my research at the moment is this shift in leadership, where trust really came from sort of confidence and conviction, and you could argue arrogance in sort of the style of leadership. And what we're moving towards is a style of leadership that is really about confident humility, is having that courage and curiosity to say that you don't know. And that's a massive shift in leadership styles that is happening right now, and I think is also sort of accelerated through the current pandemic.
Yeah, and I guess also, nobody's perfect, no leader's perfect, no company's perfect. Have you seen companies who have been able to recover? I guess you talked about the banks. So is there something about how do you recover when there's been a breach of trust? Because I guess what I'm thinking, we're so dependent on electronic infrastructure and customer data. And to be honest, you can never have a completely secure system. So there are always vulnerabilities, but customers are trusting you despite those vulnerabilities. So I guess you can end up letting people down without doing anything consciously wrong, but you need to recover from that.
Yeah, well, again, it's how you use that kind of trust issue or crisis, whether it's something minor or the magnitude of a major data breach. So you see companies use it in two very different ways. The first being, where have we got a capability problem? So Samsung, when the phones were exploding, they completely reinvented their whole health and safety check process and have ended up in a better position, right? That's a capability fix that came from a trust issue. And then you've got other organizations that are like, well, how did this happen? Yeah. Right? How did this happen? What is in our culture that enabled this kind of behavior? Do we have to change the way people are incentivized, the way people are measured, even the types of people that we're recruiting? And those organizations are just brilliant to work with, and those kinds of leaders where you're like, this is actually an opportunity to uncover something really interesting and powerful in our organization.
So you actually go into quite a lot of detail in terms of recruitment strategies and into performance criteria and things like that.
Yeah, it's so I was working with a leadership team the other day, actually, pharmaceuticals. And it was interesting because they were going on and on and on about culture, which they should do. And then we started diving into their interview process. Right. And the first 5 questions were all about competence. And it was only about 45 minutes into the interview that they were asking a character question, like really about this person's empathy or their integrity. So again, trust can be a really interesting lens in what seems like a micro issue, in terms of what are the questions that you're asking people when you're bringing them into the organization, can be a really powerful cultural indicator.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to touch on as well is, we're seeing particularly the social media companies become so big and so powerful. They're affecting, the relationship with news organizations and governments, as we've seen in Australia. There's questions around the extent to which they're affecting mental health issues across whole nations, and the costs that are then, put onto the government in terms of healthcare. So do you see that agenda, or in a sense, is trust going to become even more important with those organizations going forward? And do you see more things like what happened between Facebook and the Australian government happening as we move forward, and as the world thinks about how that technology, how that social media technology sits within a society?
100%. And I think it's in the same week, what was going on with Facebook in Australia and Canada, you had the Uber ruling with the Supreme Court in the UK around, their drivers are not contractors, they're actually employees. So, these decisions that essentially come down to a trust decision in many ways. Do your people trust you? Can people trust your product, the service, the information you're putting out in the world? Can they trust your business model, the way that you're making money? Can have a huge impact in your ability to operate, whether that's even having permission to operate in that country, or the way that you have to pay people, or even the products and services that you sell. And I really believe that over the next 10 years, the issue of platform monopolies, not just in social media, but in different areas of our lives, is going to be one of the issues of our time. And how you take that bigness that has been allowed to develop, and they've been able to say, well, this is efficiency at scale, and break that down in a way that rebuilds that trust, not just between users and the platform, but between users within the community, I think is a really big challenge.
So government's really waking up to the situation that they're responsible for.
And what is the role of regulation versus self-regulation?
Yeah.
And we have not solved that tension, and we've sort of come out of 15 years of over-relying on self-regulation, whether that's sort of review mechanics or feedback or ratings or whatever it may be, and not figured out the role of sort of quite top-down regulation that puts parameters on these things, and in many ways creates a social safety net for consumers and customers where one doesn't exist right now.
Yeah. So in summary, what the participants will get from you in your session is firstly an understanding of trust, how that manifests in terms of their personal leadership, their organization's relationship with the world. And then also, how do they really rebuild trust after a crisis? How do they think about building a culture which has trust embedded into it through various HR practices? So it's a pretty comprehensive way of thinking that you bring to these individuals.
Yeah, I mean, the design principle that I always think about when designing classes is rethinking trust. So if you walk away and you go, I now know how to think differently about trust. I've never thought of the relationship between trust and transparency or trust and innovation in that way, but I also know what to do. I have some, I don't like to call them actionable insights because it's not a list that I give, but that you will go away and behave differently or think differently about strategy or run a meeting differently, then I know it's a successful program.
So Rachel, that's been great. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. You're a huge asset to the program. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to watch the two of us talk. We really hope this gives you an insight into what the program can bring to you as a leader, and would love to see you in Oxford or on our virtual program anytime in the future. Thank you.